Please stand for the gospel reading. Praise to you, O Christ, King of eternal glory. The Lord is a great God. Oh, that today you would listen to his voice. Harden not your hearts. Praise to you, O Christ, King of eternal glory. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. And there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. And he would have gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. Then when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to the slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the slaves and asked him what was going on. The slave replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he's got him back safe and sound.' Then the older brother became angry and refused to go in. And his father came out to him and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured all your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and has been found.'" This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated.
Good morning, everyone. Our scripture reading is all about the prodigal son today. Here at All Saints, we often use the phrase, "all are welcome." We are all part of God's family, and the story of the prodigal son reminds us of this. This is a story of our identity, and I would argue that there's probably nothing more primal to one's identity than their own family. When asked to recall this famous story, this parable that most of us, if not all of us, have heard 100 times. Most of us would probably, when asked about what's the main message, what's the main idea, or what's the lasting thought or impression, most of us would talk about or make mention to the son returning to his father, and the father, of course, welcoming him back with open arms, arms of love, grace, forgiveness, the unconditional love of the father, even after the son has been wasteful with his earnings and spendings. So that's what we think of. We think of the son coming back and being welcomed. And of course, to sort of re-emphasize this idea, we have all ways of bringing up that idea. And we don't have to look any further than Ian's weekly emails that he sends out. Does anyone remember what the title or subject line of Ian's email that he sent out this week was? Or do you read Ian's email? Does anyone recall? What is it? Welcome home. Okay, so going along with that idea of welcoming the son back home. There are probably hundreds of hymns, church songs, worship songs, even popular mainstream secular tunes that refer to this story of the prodigal son. And when they do so, they're talking about it often from the son's point of view. I've traveled the roads, I've went astray, I've left you, I've wasted my days being away, etc. From the father's view, the words sound more like this. Please come home, my arms are open, I'm ready to receive you, I've been waiting for you. Amazing Grace, probably the most high-profile example of this story, which we'll be singing later today, is another example of that idea of the amazing grace and being welcomed home. And as I sort of draw from my own experience, I just want to take you back a few years to when I was a young, I'm still young, probably not the youngest one here, thanks Sophie. When I was a younger man in college, I used to tour with the university choir. And we would travel from city to city in the U.S., singing at different churches. And as a little sort of break from the choral music, we would have a quartet of 4 gentlemen from our choir, and they would sing this song called When God Ran. And the words said this, and the chorus of the song said, "He ran to me. He took me in his arms. He held my head to his chest. He said, 'My son's come home again.' He lifted my face and wiped the tears from my eyes. With forgiveness in his voice, he said, 'Son, do you know I still love you?' He ran to me." And it brought tears to my eyes every time I heard them sing this song. And it is a powerful message, no doubt. But I would like to suggest that reading further in this story reveals the greater message that you and I probably overlook. You see, the parable does not end with the son coming home. There's the welcome home party, and during this welcoming home party, the father slips outside to speak with his older son, the one who's been home all along. And what we have here is an identity crisis going on. See, the older son sees himself as a slave, but not as a son. The older brother believes he's done everything right. I've stayed home. I've been responsible with my money. I've done everything you've said. I've dotted my I's and crossed my T's. But where's my reward? Where's my party? Why was the fat calf not cut up for me ever? And so really we have 2 lost sons here in this story, each sort of going through this identity crisis. Neither son can see himself for what they truly are, which is God's beloved child and member of the family. The older brother is angry. He uses the words, when he's speaking to his father, he uses the word, "This son of yours." This son of yours. Now let's reflect on these words briefly. I think it's easy for you and I to say that everyone is a child of God. But the second that they do something that we don't approve of or disagree with, we're basically saying, this son, this daughter of yours, we make it not about ourselves, and we remove ourselves from the equation. We say, or we're thinking, they need to be maybe more like me. At least that's what we think sometimes. When someone is different, or thinks differently than we do, or acts differently than we do. But, like the father does in the story, he quickly and rightfully corrects the older brother. Basically says, excuse me, this brother of yours, not this son of yours, this again, the older brother is saying, this son of yours. The father corrects him and says, this brother of yours. Now, to me, this is really revealing stuff here. The father points out, this is not only my son, but he is just as importantly your brother. Now, this warm and fuzzy welcome home stuff that's part of this story, the stuff we recall from the prodigal son, is certainly and absolutely a core component of the story. But I believe that there is a reason that this passage was moved to the Lent season, because it was originally at a different part of the year during the lectionary, and it was moved to the Lent season. I think we need to recap who the primary message of the story is being addressed to here. You see, it's not actually addressing the rebellious younger sons and daughters who have gone out and blown their earnings. I think that you and I have probably had our moments where we were like the younger son, maybe to this day, and things like immediate gratification, they come naturally to us. It's kind of in our blood. And so I think this is, when hearing this story from the sinner's perspective, it's a message it's very beautiful to receive that message. Unconditional love and the grace. It sounds magical. And it is. But this is a passage that was chosen for us in our church here for the Lent season. And so I think there's something that may be a bit harder for us to chew on at times. Jesus is actually looking straight into the eyes of the hostile older brothers and sisters who feel right, who feel superior, and who feel offended. He's looking at those who refuse to join the party and join God and welcoming those into the family as a sister or a brother. The lost son in this story is actually the older brother. As the story concludes, he is the one who is the outsider. This coming as a result of his refusal to love. Jesus, as he's telling this parable, invites his intended audience to look at themselves in the mirror. Our reading today, our gospel reading today, is paired with Luke 15, 1-3, which is setting up this parable and taking us to that time. Now all of the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." And so he told them this parable. Now with these verses setting the stage, I believe that imagining this parable actually comes secondary to imagining what it was like when Jesus was actually sharing this parable. Okay, so there's some multiple layers going on here. We have the story itself, but then we can imagine Jesus telling the story. So Jesus has these sinners, these tax collectors, these people that are frowned upon by much of society, and they are listening to him. And I'm imagining this, and he's telling this story, and these groups of stories. He's talking about the son who's coming home, who's been away, he's wasted his father's earnings, and they're all receiving the story well, but remember who else is there? Probably off to the side, perhaps in the back. You have the religious folk, the Sadducees, the scribes, probably have their arms crossed, probably rather angrily listening to this story that Jesus is telling, basically saying, I will welcome you home even after all you've done. And they're grumbling. And as Jesus is telling this story, he's probably got them in mind all along. I welcome the son home, but there's this welcome party. And he pulled the older son aside, and then he has this chat with the older son. The older brother is the lost son. As we wrap up here, I want to put forth a final thought by an author and a preacher, Brian McLaren, from one of his books. Why did Jesus, Moses, and the Buddha cross the road? That's the name of the book. He quotes, "Could it be that our core doctrines are even more wonderful and challenging than we previously imagined, asking us not simply to assent them in the presence of our fellow assenters, but to practice them in relationships with those who don't hold them? Could our core doctrines in this way become healing teachings, intended to diagnose and heal our distorted and hostile identities, restoring a strong and benevolent identity, and unleashing in us a joyful desire to converse and eat with the other? Could our core teachings be shared, not as ultimata, believe or die, but rather as gifts? Here's how we see things. Here's what it does for us. Could each of us examine our heart for traces of the older brother resident there?" End quote. The parable of the prodigal son teaches us that we absolutely cannot afford to maintain hostility against the other without withdrawing from our Creator, the one who loves both you and the other as a beloved child. When we maintain this hostility, we stop acting like a son or a daughter in the same family. We leave our true identity as sons and daughters, and we play the part of the slave. When we cut off the other, we break God's heart. God wants us to join God in loving the other as part of one family. When we say all are welcome, do we really mean it? Let us search our hearts for traces of the older brother and seek healing starting right now.